The first chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the infrastructural ostracization of the unwanted. This is the narrative vertical segregation, where the physical architecture of the world, the rickety scaffolding and precarious walkways of Blighttown, represents the metastatic decay Gwyn and his lords allowed to fester beneath the feet of the divine. Within the creaking of rotted timber and the viscous slapping of the mud, the world witnessed the theological abandonment of the bottom. The lore of this era is the lore of the geographic displacement. Its purpose was the physical containment of the impure through topographical burial. The history of the town is the history of the Great Submergence, where the refuse of civilization drained into the lowest pits to ensure the purity of the upper berg, while creating a festering monument to the gods' neglect. This is the tragedy of the leaking ceiling, proving that order is a filter that pushes the pollution down to maintain the illusion of the clean. The lore of the scaffolding and the logic of the temporary provides the engineering foundation for this chapter's instability. As the sanitation of Lordran failed, the builders erected wooden spindles against the stone walls, representing the hasty attempt to store the unwanted in a vertical vacuum. The lore suggests that the latter is the icon of the desperate ascent. Its purpose was the standardization of the precarious existence. By fastening rotten planks with rusted iron, the outcasts proved that survival is a fragile balance, showing that divinity is a height. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the descent. The gods needed a basement where the broken could congregate to prevent the scent of death from rising to Aner Londo. This was the era of the rickety foundation. This shows that the history of Blighttown is a history of the gravity, which turns civilization into weight. The physical environment of the leaking sewers and the industrial drain provides insight into the atmospheric poisoning of the fall. This is a space designed by exertion, representing the gods' admission that Lordran was vomiting its own excess. The lore of the depth's entrance explains that its purpose was the spiritual gutter of the capital. In the dark, the undead find that the water is brown with the memory of the above, showing that light requires the excrement of the holy. This reveals the administrative purpose of the pipe. The gods built a sluice where the human becomes a sediment to fuel the Lord's cleanliness. This was the era of the stagnant poor. This shows that the history of the drain is a history of the residue. The relationship between the blowdart snipers and the guerrilla paranoia represents the sociological retaliation within the narrative. The inhabitants developed poisoned darts to protect their misery, representing the presence of the outcasts will in the shadow of the pillar. The lore suggests that the sniper is the icon of the hidden resentment. Its purpose was the maintenance of the territorial isolation. By targeting the intruder with toxic spit, the resident proved that sovereignty is aggression when the home is a pit, showing that in Blighttown, safety hardens into venom. This reveals the cynical purpose of the toxin. The man attempted to replicate the god's distance through the fear of the touch. Furthermore, the lore of the infested ghouls and the loss of the human form represents the biological adaptation within the fall. The citizens mutated to survive the blight, representing the persistence of the will to live in the heart of the waste. The lore suggests that the ghoul is the icon of the metabolic despair. Its purpose was the maintenance of the festering presence. By eating the rot, the ghoul proved that life is a parasite, showing that in the age of fire, humanity becomes a deformity. This reveals the predatory purpose of the scream. The god needed the monster to keep the traveler terrified of the below. The relationship between the Great Club and the primitive regression represents the infrastructural devolution within the fall. The infested barbarians used logs to crush the faithful, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' abandonment. The lore suggests that the club is the archive of the technological failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the blunt reality. By striking with the weight of the tree, the barbarian proved that culture kills the truth it meant to elevate when the tools rot, showing that in Lordran, history is a crushing impact. This reveals the judicial purpose of the strength The father built the pit to freeze the primal rage. The lore of the fire dogs and the domestication of the flame represents the elemental degradation within the narrative. In the heat, beasts breathe a weak fire, representing the horror of the gods' dying magic, inhabiting the mutt. The lore suggests that the fire dog is the filter of the combustion. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the darkened alley. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a cur to ensure that light was replaced by heat. This shows that the history of the dog is a history of the scavenge. The relationship between the crag spiders and the vertical infiltration represents the administrative panic within the fall. The chaos spread from Izalith into the town, proving that the gods failed to seal the leaking flesh. The lore suggests that the crag spider is the measurement of the Lord's incompetence. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological buffer. By allowing the spider to roam the scaffolding, Gwyn confirmed that safety is infestation, showing that the sun required a mote of wings. This reveals the defensive purpose of the climb. The god built the labyrinth to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the swaying platform, realizing that Blighttown was a silent execution of the dignity, who stacked the broken to preserve the sky. The purpose of the descent lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the vertical lie. It shows that ascension is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a swaying ledge for the Father. The rise of the scaffolding is the final movement of the displacement lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, architecture is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the lowest to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the upper town in this chapter is the horror of the geographic displacement. We realize that urbanization was a bloody calculation and rot was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own denial. The purpose of the workshop of the mire was to catalog the gravity, and the fall was the beginning of the swamp. As the wood groans on the wall and the undead stands in the silent dark, hearing the echo of the dart echoing through the empty spires, they understand that the history of Blighttown is the history of the fall, a fall that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the molecular degradation of the physical vessel. This is the narrative chemical incarceration, where the physical architecture of the world, the stagnant pools and iridescent slicks of the Blighttown Basin, represents the subterranean laboratory of unintentional cruelty Gwyn's order inflicted upon the living. Within the gurgling of noxious gas and the sloshing of liquid rot, the world witnessed the theological liquefaction of the flesh. The lore of this era is the lore of the sickness. Its purpose was the biological management of the exile through attrition. The history of the water is the history of the Great Dilution, where the waste of the sunlight infused with the dark of the depths to ensure the human body remained in a state of permanent vulnerability. This is the tragedy of the liquid chain, proving that nature is a poison that de-dissolves the resilience to satisfy the crown. The lore of the toxin and the logic of the accumulation provides the chemical foundation for this chapter's agony. As the effluent from the upper world settled in the basement, it represented the physical sum of the gods' arrogance. The lore suggests that the purple moss is the icon of the desperate neutralization. Its purpose was the standardization of the metabolic struggle. By ingesting the rot through the skin, the outcasts proved that identity is a soluble resource, showing that divinity is a purity. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the sickness. The gods needed a plague to ensure the broken were too weak to climb the wall. This was the era of the fevered breath. This shows that the history of the water is a history of the concentration, which turns life into sludge. The physical environment of the swamp floor and the viscous mire provides insight into the atmospheric corruption of the fall. This is a space designed by neglect, representing the gods' omission of the basic necessity of ground. The lore of the rusted iron ring explains that its purpose was the spiritual adaptation to the resistance. In the mud, the undead find that movement is a privilege of the prepared, showing that light requires the fluidity of the free. This reveals the administrative purpose of the mire. The gods built a trap where the human becomes a statue of silt to fuel the Lord's efficiency. This was the era of the heavy step. This shows that the history of the swamp is a history of the friction. The relationship between the giant mosquitoes and the airborne infection represents the biological surveillance within the narrative. These vessels of blight evolved to transfer the poison from the pool to the spirit, representing the presence of the swamp's will in the air of the pit. The lore suggests that the mosquito is the icon of the relentless pursuit. Its purpose was the maintenance of the inescapable sickness. By injecting the toxic blood into the unwary, the insect proved that order is aggression when the air is a weapon, showing that in Blighttown, breath hardens into phlegm. This reveals the cynical purpose of the flight. The man attempted to escape the mud only to be caught by the wing. Furthermore, the lore of the leech and the metabolic recycling represents the sociological scavenge within the fall. The slugs fed on the rot to produce the titanite, representing the persistence of the utility in the heart of the filth. The lore suggests that the large leech is the icon of the alchemical despair. Its purpose was the maintenance of the resourceful misery. By distilling the toxin into metal, the leech proved that wealth is a byproduct, showing that in the age of fire, evolution becomes a harvest. This reveals the predatory purpose of the shards. The god needed the sliver to supply the insanity of the blacksmith. The relationship between the toxic dart and the concentration of malice represents the infrastructural violence within the fall. The snipers distilled the swamp into a point, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' concentrated judgment. The lore suggests that the dart is the archive of the molecular failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the sharp agony. By piercing the shield with the essence of the blight, the resident proved that knowledge kills the peace it meant to preserve when the medicine fails, showing that in Lordran, history is a burning vein. This reveals the judicial purpose of the sting. The father built the pit to freeze the internal fire. The lore of the power within and the pyromancy of the desperation represents the elemental self-destruction within the narrative. In the dark, sorcerers burned their own life to survive the blight, representing the horror of the gods' borrowed strength. The lore suggests that the internal flame is the filter of the resilience. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the suicide drive. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a spell to ensure that life was replaced by combustion. This shows that the history of the pyromancy is a history of the consumption. The relationship between the dung pie and the rejection of the self represents the administrative disgust within the fall. The outcasts threw their own waste to induce a lesser toxic, proving that the gods forced the man to choose his own poison. The lore suggests that the dung pie is the measurement of the Lord's humiliation. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological paradox. By embracing the excrement, the resident confirmed that safety is defilement, showing that the sun required a mote of shame. This reveals the defensive purpose of the throw. The god built the pit to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the bubbling surface, realizing that Blighttown was a silent chemistry of the end who boiled the flesh to preserve the skin. The purpose of the sickness lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the chemical lie. It shows that health is a symptom of control. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a festering vat for the father. The rise of the toxin is the final movement of the mutation lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, metabolism is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the system to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the well in this chapter is the horror of the molecular degradation. We realize that adaptation was a bloody calculation and water was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the toxins was to catalog the agony, and the fall was the beginning of the fever. As the bubble pops on the mud and the undead stands in the silent mire, hearing the echo of the gurgle echoing through the empty spires. They understand that the history of the well is the history of the sickness, a sickness that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the biological martyrdom of the Southern Sentinel. This is the narrative maternal predation, where the physical architecture of the world, the white silk tunnels and lava-scorched earth of Quelaag's domain, represents the fleshly barrier the witch's kin erected to protect their dying family. Within the hissing of the magma and the sticky stretching of the web, the world witnessed the theological distortion of the sisterhood. The lore of this era is the lore of the fire silk. Its purpose was the biological sustenance of the fair lady through the consumption of the humanity. The history of the Spider Bride is the history of the Great Hunt, where the daughter of chaos slew the travelers to extract the warmth necessary to soothe the agony of her sick sibling. This is the tragedy of the predatory love, proving that sacrifice is a cannibalism that devours the stranger to satisfy the kin. The lore of chaos, which Quelaag and the logic of the hybrid provides the evolutionary foundation for this chapter's horror. As a survivor of the chaos catastrophe in Izalith, she represented the incomplete escape from the flame. The lore suggests that Quelaag is the icon of the protective fury. Her purpose was the standardization of the territorial defense. By merging her human torso with the abdomen of a lava-spitting arachnid, the witch proved that identity is a malleable shell, showing that divinity is a mutation. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the bell. The gods needed a gatekeeper to ensure the human never disturbed the secret of the failed flame. This was the era of the silk shield. This shows that the history of the bride is a history of the hunger, which turns beauty into bait. The physical environment of the silk-choked caves and the magma pools provides insight into the atmospheric entrapment of the fall. This is a nest designed by instinct, representing the gods' admission that the swamp was evolving into a living organism. The lore of the Chaos Blade explains that its purpose was the spiritual link to the suffering. In the heat, the undead finds that power costs the blood of the wielder, showing that light requires the self-harm of the powerful. This reveals the administrative purpose of the lair. The gods built a buffer where the human becomes a nutrient to fuel the sisters' relief. This was the era of the burning web. This shows that the history of the cave is a history of the consumption. The relationship between the bell of awakening and the call to the fort represents the sociological manipulation within the narrative. The sound of the bell signals the success of the pilgrim, representing the presence of the god's schedule in the heart of the filth. The lore suggests that the second bell is the icon of the mechanical progress. Its purpose was the maintenance of the scripted journey. By ringing the iron after slaying the spider, the undead proved that achievement is a trigger for the next trial, showing that in Blighttown, victory hardens into obligation. This reveals the cynical purpose of the tone. The god needed the hunter to clear the path to the old home. Furthermore, the lore of the egg-burdened and the parasitic devotion represents the ecological submission within the fall. The servants carried the spawn of the fair lady on their backs, representing the persistence of the worship in the face of the deformity. The lore suggests that Ingi is the icon of the exiled devotion. Its purpose was the maintenance of the living vessel. By nurturing the larvae within the flesh, the servant proved that faith is a biological hosting, showing that in the age of fire, love becomes an infestation. This reveals the predatory purpose of the egg. The sister needed the body to supply the insanity of the nursery. The relationship between the fair lady and the muted martyrdom represents the infrastructural pity within the fall. The white sister absorbed the blight to save the residents, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' broken compassion. The lore suggests that the daughter of chaos is the archive of the altruistic failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the dying mercy. By losing her sight and legs to drink the poison, the lady proved that kindness kills the savior it meant to exalt when the sin is infinite, showing that in Lordran history is a muffled cough. This reveals the judicial purpose of the covenant. The Father built the wall to freeze the guilt. The lore of the chaos pyromancy and the art of the flame life represents the biological magic within the narrative. In the domain, fire takes the form of lava, representing the horror of the god's inability to distinguish heat from growth. The lore suggests that the great chaos fireball is the filter of the potency. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the destructive vitality. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a flame to ensure that life was replaced by persistence. This shows that the history of the art is a history of the scar. The relationship between the humanity offering and the restoration of the health represents the administrative greed within the fall. The undead must feed the spider sister to open the shortcut, proving that the gods engineered the cannibalism of the humanity to save the demonic. The lore suggests that the offering is the measurement of the Lord's coldness. This purpose was the creation of a psychological transaction. By buying the life of the lady with the souls of the living, the player confirmed that safety is barter, showing that the sun required a mote of stolen essence. This reveals the defensive purpose of the door. The god built the seal to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the weeping sister, realizing that Quelaag was a silent patricide of her own soul who hunted the world to save her bed. The purpose of the spider lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the maternal lie. It shows that protection is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a smoldering cradle for the father. The rise of the Spider Bride is the final movement of the sacrifice lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, love is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the sister to satisfy the chaos. The legacy of the daughter in this chapter is the horror of the biological martyrdom. We realize that mercy was a bloody calculation and silk was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own failure. The purpose of the workshop of the web was to catalog the agony, and the fall was the beginning of the blight. As the lava gleams on the wall and the undead stands in the silent domain, hearing the echo of the heartbeat echoing through the empty spires, they understand that the history of Quelaag is the history of the sister, a sister that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the metaphysical regression through the roots of the world. This is the narrative vertical archaism, where the physical architecture of the world, the intertwining roots and labyrinthine bark of the Great Hollow, represents the geological memory of the era before the fire. Within the muffled groans of ancient wood and the infinite vertigo of the drop, the world witnessed the theological discovery of the foundation. The lore of this era is the lore of the Archtree. Its purpose was the biological infrastructure of the world pillars. The history of the Hollow is the history of the Great Descent, where the undead bypasses the lies of the gods to witness the cold reality of the stone trees that support the reality of Lordran. This is the tragedy of the hidden spine, proving that civilization is a surface that rests on the indifferent to satisfy the ego. The lore of the archtrees and the logic of the unchanging provides the physical foundation for this chapter's scale. As the living veneer of the sun thinned, the roots revealed the pre-fire structure of the universe. The lore suggests that the hollow tree is the icon of the material continuity. Its purpose was the standardization of the planetary support. By lifting the crust of the earth above the fog, the trees proved that existence is a geometric necessity, showing that divinity is a parasite on the ancient. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the hidden path. The gods needed the human to believe the world began with the flame, so they concealed the roots. This was the era of the stone pillar. This shows that the history of the Hollow is a history of the origin, which turns time into fiber. The physical environment of the vertical maze and the fungal growth provides insight into the atmospheric isolation of the fall. This is a space designed by nature, representing the god's inability to colonize the deepest structures. The lore of the basilisks explains that its purpose was the biological deterrence of the truth-seeker. In the trunk, the large-eyed lizards proved that knowledge kills through the curse of stagnation, showing that light requires the blindness of the inquisitive. This reveals the administrative purpose of the tree. The gods built a barrier of death to ensure the human never reached the bottom. This was the era of the petrified breath. This shows that the history of the trunk is a history of the curse. The relationship between the mushroom people and the ecology of the decay represents the sociological resilience within the narrative. These entities fed on the ancient moisture, representing the presence of a life that precedes the soul. The lore suggests that the mushroom parent is the icon of the primordial violence. Its purpose was the maintenance of the natural border. By crushing the intruder with fungal strength, the parent proved that power can exist without the fire, showing that in the hollow, growth hardens into impact. This reveals the cynical purpose of the invasion. The man attempted to steal the ancient treasure and was shattered by the pre-human. Furthermore, the lore of the crystal lizards and the mineral wealth represents the infrastructural extraction within the fall. The beasts absorbed the magic of the tree to form titanite, representing the persistence of the lordly greed even in the depths. The lore suggests that the lizard is the icon of the fleeting opportunity. Its purpose was the maintenance of the resourceful hunt. By luring the undead to the edge of the abyss, the beast proved that greed is a suicide, showing that in the age of fire, wealth becomes a tumble. This reveals the predatory purpose of the slab. The god needed the bait to supply the insanity of the weapon. The relationship between the clutter of the branches and the logic of the fall represents the geometrical chaos within the narrative. The undead must navigate a path that was not built for feet, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's inhuman foundation. The lore suggests that the root is the archive of the pre-civilized failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the infinite descent. By turning the world into a vertical sieve, the hollow proved that order kills the peace it meant to establish when the floor disappears, showing that in Lordran, history is a long drop. This reveals the judicial purpose of the plunge. The father built the high to freeze the low. The lore of the Chloranthy ring and the stamina of the root represents the biological persistence within the narrative. In the bark, an artifact grows to accelerate the heart, representing the horror of the god's need for infinite movement. The lore suggests that the ring is the filter of the exhaustion. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the endless climb. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a gift to ensure that life was replaced by activity. This shows that the history of the ring is a history of the pulse. The relationship between the Ash Lake entrance and the fragmentation of the illusion represents the administrative fear within the fall. Gwyn locked the way to the lake behind two hidden walls, proving that he feared the sight of the truth more than the blight. The lore suggests that the illusionary wall is the measurement of the god's insecurity. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological buffer. By hiding the root, Gwyn confirmed that safety is ignorance, showing that the sun required a mote of wood. This reveals the defensive purpose of the secret. The god built the maze to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the bottomless pit, realizing that the Great Hollow was a silent patron of the gravity who buried the origin to preserve the top. The purpose of the hollow lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the foundational lie. It shows that civilization is a symptom of denial. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a fragile branch for the father. The rise of the Archtree is the final movement of the regression lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, foundation is not a birth, it is a cover that exhausts the root to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the hollow in this chapter is the horror of the metaphysical regression. We realize that reality was a bloody calculation and bark was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own insecurity. The purpose of the workshop of the roots was to catalog the depth, and the fall was the beginning of the end. As the sap gleams on the wall and the undead stands in the silent trunk, hearing the echo of the fall echoing through the empty spires. They understand that the history of the hollow is the history of the root, a root that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The fifth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the primordial stagnation at the root of the world. This is the narrative geological finality, where the physical architecture of the world, the infinite gray sands and petrified arch trees of Ash Lake, represents the original state that existed before Gwyn ignited the first spark. Within the rhythm of the eternal tide and the monolithic stillness of the horizon, the world witnessed the theological burial of the prehistory. The lore of this era is the lore of the everlasting. Its purpose was the biological archiving of the Age of Ancients. The history of the lake is the history of the great survivor, where the stone dragon waits in the silence to ensure the memory of the unchanging remains hidden from the gods' sunlight. This is the tragedy of the empty shore, proving that eternity is a stasis that outlasts the flicker to satisfy the void. The lore of the stone dragon and the logic of the transcendence provides the evolutionary foundation for this chapter's piece. As the sole heir to the ancient order, the dragon represented the immortality that Gwyn feared. The lore suggests that the dragon is the icon of the mineral patience. Its purpose was the standardization of the post-human observation. By allowing the undead to join its covenant through the dragon headstone, the being proved that identity is a temporary flesh, showing that divinity is a scale. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the lake. The gods needed a cemetery for the old world to prevent the return of the unchanging. This was the era of the gray stillness. This shows that the history of the lake is a history of the stone. The physical environment of the infinite beach and the black water provides insight into the atmospheric nihilism of the fall. This is a space designed by absence, representing the gods' failure to light the foundation of the planet. The lore of the man-eater Mildred explains that its purpose was the spiritual link to the primitive hunger. Even at the edge of the truth, the human remains a predator, showing that light requires the meat of the fallen. This reveals the administrative purpose of the shore. The gods built a desert where the human becomes a speck to fuel the Lord's self-importance. This was the era of the gray dust. This shows that the history of the sands is a history of the erosion. The relationship between the Great Hydra and the Elemental Guardian represents the ecological retaliation within the narrative. The beast of many heads patrolled the water, representing the presence of the ancient fury in the heart of the quiet. The lore suggests that the Hydra is the icon of the automatic defense. Its purpose was the maintenance of the forbidden peace. By spitting water bolts at the trespasser, the monster proved that nature is aggression when the sanctuary is discovered, showing that in Ash Lake, stillness hardens into violence. This reveals the cynical purpose of the Guardian. The god needed the monster to scare the truth seeker. Furthermore, the lore of the dragon apostles and the path of the dragon represents the sociological defection within the fall. Humans sought to discard their mortality to become dragons, representing the persistence of the disgust with the god's dying system. The lore suggests that the apostle is the icon of the biological treason. His purpose was the maintenance of the ancient transformation. By praying to the stone dragon, the man proved that faith is a regression, showing that in the age of fire, evolution becomes a backward step. This reveals the predatory purpose of the scale. The god needed the human to stay in the fire to preserve the sun. The relationship between the arch trees and the pillar of the reality represents the infrastructural truth within the fall. The lake reveals that Lordran is merely one city atop an infinite forest, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's small kingdom. The lore suggests that the pillar is the archive of the geological failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the infinite foundation. By holding the world on its shoulders, the tree proved that order kills the scale it meant to control when the secret leaks, showing that in Lordran history is a gray pillar. This reveals the judicial purpose of the lake. The father built the top to forget the bottom. The lore of the dragon greatsword and the tail-cut ritual represents the sacramental mutilation within the narrative. In the silence, the undead severs the limb of the immortal, representing the horror of the gods' need to arm the successor with the remnant. The lore suggests that the greatsword is the filter of the primitive. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the ancient might. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a weapon to ensure that life was replaced by metal. This shows that the history of the sword is a history of the severance. The relationship between the everlasting dragon and the indestructible stasis represents the administrative oversight within the fall. Gwyn failed to kill every dragon, proving that his victory was incomplete. The lore suggests that the survivor is the measurement of the gods' limits. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological anchor. By existing in the dark, the dragon confirmed that safety is irrelevance, showing that the sun required a moat of gray. This reveals the defensive purpose of the bottom. The god built the law to avoid the lake. The act concludes with the silent observation of the unblinking eye, realizing that Ash Lake was a silent patron of the indifference who watched the fire burn from the outside. The purpose of the lake lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the geological lie. It shows that history is a symptom of perspective. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a thin crust for the father. The rise of the stone dragon is the final movement of the stagnation lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, eternity is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the stone to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the lake in this chapter is the horror of the primordial stagnation. We realize that victory was a bloody calculation and gray was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own denial. The purpose of the workshop of the shore was to catalog the silence, and the fall was the beginning of the ash. As the tide gleams on the sand and the undead stands in the silent cemetery, hearing the echo of the wind echoing through the empty arch tree. They understand that the history of Ash Lake is the history of the stone, a stone that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the metabolic perversion of the urban underside. This is the narrative systemic ingestion, where the physical architecture of the world, the slime-coated tunnels and flooded abattoirs of the depths, represents the intestinal logic Gwyn's civilization used to process its own failures. Within the rhythmic squelching of the puddles and the metallic scent of raw meat, the world witnessed the theological mutilation of the appetite. The lore of this era is the lore of the throat. Its purpose was the biological disposal of the excess through the gaping hunger. The history of the depths is the history of the Great Digestion, where the sunlight pushed the vermin into the drains to ensure the upper berg remained unaware of the rot required to feed the city. This is the tragedy of the open mouth, proving that civilization is a belly that grinds the unwanted to satisfy the Lord. The lore of the gaping dragon and the logic of the gluttony provides the evolutionary foundation for this chapter's distortion. Once a descendant of the ancients, the dragon represented the degradation of the immortal into a living stomach. The lore suggests that the gaping dragon is the icon of the desperate consumption. Its purpose was the standardization of the urban waste processing. By opening its ribcage into a massive mouth of teeth, the dragon proved that identity is a hungry void, showing that divinity is an avarice. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the key. The gods needed a garbage disposal to ensure the human never felt the weight of the refuse. This was the era of the endless meal. This shows that the history of the dragon is a history of the appetite, which turns ancient into acid. The physical environment of the butcher's table and the pile of slime provides insight into the atmospheric butchery of the fall. This is a space designed by hunger, representing the god's admission that Lordran was cannibalizing its own future. The lore of the butcher explains that its purpose was the spiritual management of the flesh. In the dark, the undead find that life is a cut of meat waiting for the cleaver, showing that light requires the blood of the low. This reveals the administrative purpose of the basement. The gods built a kitchen where the human becomes a sack of dregs to fuel the Lord's indulgence. This was the era of the raw meat. This shows that the history of the butchers is a history of the harvest. The relationship between the basilisks and the petrification of the breath represents the biological stagnation within the narrative. These vessels of curse inhabited the pipes to transform the living into stone, representing the presence of the depths will in the lungs of the intruder. The lore suggests that the basilisk is the icon of the instant silence. Its purpose was the maintenance of the static grave. By exhaling the cloud of crystallization, the lizard proved that order is extinction when the air is a trap, showing that in the depths, breath hardens into statue. This reveals the cynical purpose of the cloud. The man attempted to breathe the sun and was choked by the sewer. Furthermore, the lore of the channeler and the divine oversight represents the sociological surveillance within the fall. Seth's messenger observed the mutations of the low, representing the persistence of the god's curiosity in the heart of the misery. The lore suggests that the channeler is the icon of the voyeuristic power. Its purpose was the maintenance of the experimental continuity. By buffing the rats with magic, the sorcerer proved that power is a spectacle, showing that in the age of fire, suffering becomes a research. This reveals the predatory purpose of the trident. The god needed the data to supply the insanity of the archive. The relationship between the giant rats and the urban decay represents the infrastructural infestation within the fall. The vermin grew to impossibility by feeding on the dregs, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's wasteful economy. The lore suggests that the Great Rat is the archive of the metabolic failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the unchecked growth. By turning the scavenger into a king, the depths proved that neglect kills the peace it meant to preserve when the bottom rises, showing that in Lordran, history is a gnawing tooth. This reveals the judicial purpose of the pipe. The father built the drain to freeze the human waste. The lore of the spider shield and the defensive adaptation represents the biological foreboding within the narrative. In the depths, a shield resists the poison of the blight, representing the horror of the god's need for temporary immunization. The lore suggests that the spider shield is the filter of the transition. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the borderland. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a wall to ensure that life was replaced by hardness. This shows that the history of the shield is a history of the border. The relationship between the sewer chamber and the false safety represents the administrative manipulation within the fall. Gwyn placed a bonfire in a caged room, proving that he monitored the prison for endurance. The lore suggests that the chamber is the measurement of the Lord's mercy. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological anchor. By giving the undead a rest in the slime, Gwyn confirmed that safety is stagnation, showing that the sun required a moat of iron. This reveals the defensive purpose of the gate. The god built the lock to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the open drain, realizing that the depths was a silent factory of the filth who digested the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the sewer lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the metabolic lie. It shows that order is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a rotted gut for the father. The rise of the gaping dragon is the final movement of the digestion lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, governance is not a birth, it is a cover that exhausts the belly to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the depths in this chapter is the horror of the metabolic perversion. We realize that sanitation was a bloody calculation and meat was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own disgust. The purpose of the workshop of the throat was to catalog the hunger, and the fall was the beginning of the gape. As the acid gleams on the stone, and the undead stands in the silent tunnel, hearing the echo of the gnashing echoing through the empty spires. They understand that the history of the depths is the history of the stomach, a stomach that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the nutritional reclamation of the divine waste. This is the narrative viscous metabolism, where the physical architecture of the world, the endless mudflats and semi-liquid silt of the lower Blighttown swamp, represents the biological sump, where the laws of the surface dissolve into a primordial soup. Within the rhythmic sucking of the mud and the phosphorescent glow of the decay, the world witnessed the theological fermentation of the spirit. The lore of this era is the lore of the silt. Its purpose was the ecological transformation of the failed human into a subterranean resource. The history of the swamp is the history of the great composting, where the gods allowed the bottom to liquidize the history of the city to ensure the future remained unburdened by the physical bulk of the dead. This is the tragedy of the living compost, proving that nature is a solution that melts the individual to satisfy the soil. The lore of the giant leech and the logic of the siphon provides the biological foundation for this chapter's recycling. As the life of the above leaked into the basement, it represented the nutritional tax the swamp extracted from the gods. The lore suggests that the leech is the icon of the parasitic balance. Its purpose was the standardization of the fluid extraction. By attaching to the skin to drink the soul, the leech proved that identity is a liquid currency, showing that divinity is a pressure. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the silt. The gods needed a vessel to drain the human of their potential to prevent the rise of the abyss. This was the era of the sucking pulse. This shows that the history of the leech is a history of the transfusion, which turns suffering into sustenance. The physical environment of the mud dunes and the iridescent pools provides insight into the atmospheric fermentation of the fall. This is a space designed by saturation, representing the gods' admission that solidity was a luxury of the high. The lore of the crag spider explains that its purpose was the spiritual infiltration of the void. In the mud, the undead find that existence is a weight that sinks into the ancient, showing that light requires the buoyancy of the privileged. This reveals the administrative purpose of the blight. The gods built a sieve where the human becomes a sludge to fuel the Lord's stability. This was the era of the deep ooze. This shows that the history of the silt is a history of the density. The relationship between the giant slugs and the mineral excretion represents the infrastructural synthesis within the narrative. These vessels of rot produced the large titanite shards through the digestion of the waste, representing the presence of the industrial will in the heart of the festering. The lore suggests that the slug is the icon of the unconscious refinement. Its purpose was the maintenance of the resourceful decay. By excreting the metal of the gods from the belly of the slime, the slug proved that wealth is a bowel movement, showing that in Blighttown, value hardens into residue. This reveals the cynical purpose of the drop. The man attempted to find the sword in the excrement. Furthermore, the lore of the blowdart snipers and the chemical surveillance represents the sociological policing within the fall. The guards harvested the swamp to create the toxin, representing the persistence of the weaponization of the environment in the heart of the misery. The lore suggests that the sniper is the icon of the distilled malice. Its purpose was the maintenance of the paranoiac isolation. By forcing the intruder to experience the swamp in a single needle, the resident proved that order is injection, showing that in the age of fire, interaction becomes a poisoning. This reveals the predatory purpose of the dart. The god needed the barrier to supply the insanity of the quarantine. The relationship between the rusted iron ring and the defiance of the viscosity represents the mechanical resistance within the fall. An artifact lost in the asylum allows the feet to pierce the mud, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's control over velocity. The lore suggests that the ring is the archive of the kinetic failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the freed step. By neutralizing the friction of the blight, the ring proved that freedom kills the peace it meant to enforce when the movement returns, showing that in Lordran, history is a churning step. This reveals the judicial purpose of the heavy. The Father built the swamp to freeze the human will. The lore of the severed tail and the gift of the dragon represents the sacramental extraction within the narrative. In the deep, the undead harvests the limb of the eternal to form a shield, representing the horror of the gods' need to armor the successor with the fossil. The lore suggests that the Great Shield is the filter of the durability. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the primeval might. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a wall to ensure that life was replaced by stone. This shows that the history of the shell is a history of the defense. The relationship between the poison mist and the respiratory conquest represents the administrative oversight within the fall. Pyromancers learned to exhale the atmosphere of the swamp, proving that the gods successfully transformed the blight into a utility. The lore suggests that the mist is the measurement of the Lord's efficiency. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological cloud. By turning the pollution into a spell, the scholar confirmed that safety is assimilation, showing that the sun required a mote of breath. This reveals the defensive purpose of the vapor. The god built the pit to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the sinking bone, realizing that the swamp of sorrow was a silent compost of the ambition, who dissolved the spirit to fertilize the void. The purpose of the swamp lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the nutritional lie. It shows that ecology is a symptom of control. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a liquid grave for the Father. The rise of the silt is the final movement of the recycling lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, nature is not a birth, it is a cover that exhausts the waste to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the swamp in this chapter is the horror of the nutritional reclamation. We realize that resourcefulness was a bloody calculation and mud was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own disgust. The purpose of the workshop of the silt was to catalog the dissolution, and the fall was the beginning of the soup. As the bubble pops on the surface and the undead stands in the silent basin, hearing the echo of the suction echoing through the empty spires, they understand that the history of the swamp is the history of the silt, a silt that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the infrastructural deterrence of the divine perimeter. This is the narrative geopolitically charged segregation, where the physical architecture of the world, the narrow cliffside paths, and the monolithic floodgates of the Valley of Drakes represents the industrial choke point Gwyn's engineers established to separate the drowned from the diseased. Within the howl of the high-altitude wind and the crackling of arcane lightning, the world witnessed the theological fortification of the threshold. The lore of this era is the lore of the Surge. Its purpose was the electrified quarantine of the undead through topographical terror. The history of the valley is the history of the Great Border, where the Blue Drakes patrolled the chasm to ensure the horrors of Blighttown and the ghosts of New Londo never converged to threaten the divine ascent. This is the tragedy of the electric fence, proving that safety is a voltage that fry the desperate to satisfy the crown. The lore of the Blue Drakes and the logic of the degenerate wing provides the evolutionary foundation for this chapter's defense. As distant cousins of the ancients, these drakes represented the gods' weaponization of the incomplete, immortal. The lore suggests that the drake is the icon of the aerial incarceration. Its purpose was the standardization of the perimeter enforcement. By exhaling bolts of blue lightning, the drakes proved that identity is a conductive resource, showing that divinity is a frequency. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the cliff. The gods needed a sentry to ensure the broken felt the spark of the law before they tasted the air of the free. This was the era of the thunderous canyon. This shows that the history of the valley is a history of the shock, which turns nature into security. The physical environment of the floodgates and the submerged sin provides insight into the atmospheric repression of the fall. This is a space designed by hydraulics, representing the gods' admission that the dark of New Londo was only contained by the weight of the sea. The lore of the key to the seal explains that its purpose was the spiritual damming of the abyss. In the wind, the undead finds that progress is a heavy lever that releases the hidden genocide, showing that light requires the drowning of the populace. This reveals the administrative purpose of the stone. The gods built a plug where the human becomes a saturant to fuel the Lord's dryness. This was the era of the sunken whale. This shows that the history of the gates is a history of the pressure. The relationship between the undead dragon and the necrotic border represents the metabolic rot within the narrative. A massive carcass clings to the rock, representing the persistence of the gods' failure to cleanly kill the past. The lore suggests that the undead dragon is the icon of the rotting vigil. Its purpose was the maintenance of the disgusting deterrence. By vomiting toxic sludge onto the narrow path, the corpse proved that order is contamination when the grave is unsealed, showing that in the valley, life hardens into pus. This reveals the cynical purpose of the blight. The man attempted to bypass the fire and was caught by the decay. Furthermore, the lore of the small Londo elevator and the vertical shortcut represents the sociological stratification within the fall. A caged lift links the valley to the Firelink shrine, representing the persistence of the gods' backdoor access to the ghetto. The lore suggests that the lift is the icon of the bureaucratic escape. Its purpose was the maintenance of the elite connectivity. By placing the key in the depths of the swamp, the gods proved that knowledge is a hiding place, showing that in the age of fire, freedom becomes a stolen switch. This reveals the predatory purpose of the gate. The god needed the shortcut to supply the insanity of the oversight. The relationship between the Astora Straightsword and the fallen nobility represents the infrastructural failure within the fall. In the claws of the undead dragon, a holy blade rots, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' abandoned knights. The lore suggests that the Straightsword is the archive of the martial vanity. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine impotence. By leaving the faith to be chewed by the zombie, the valley proved that piety kills the warrior it meant to protect when the sun sets, showing that in Lordran, history is a rusted edge. This reveals the judicial purpose of the lute. The father built the chasm to freeze the human failure. The lore of the red tearstone ring and the desperate strength represents the biological brinkmanship within the narrative. On a lonely tower, an artifact glows when the body is dying, representing the horror of the gods' need for end-state efficiency. The lore suggests that the tearstone is the filter of the fatality. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the terminal agony. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a ring to ensure that life was replaced by adrenaline. This shows that the history of the ring is a history of the finality. The relationship between the dragon crest shield and the elemental resistance represents the administrative oversight within the fall. A shield designed to block the flame sits in the valley of the lightning, proving that the gods successfully mismanaged the defense of the perimeter. The lore suggests that the shield is the measurement of the Lord's confusion. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological anchor. By arming the dead with the useless pelt, the valley confirmed that safety is irony, showing that the sun required a mote of misdirection. This reveals the defensive purpose of the crag. The god built the wall to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the windy gap, realizing that the Valley of Drakes was a silent fence of the fear who shocked the spirit to preserve the skin. The purpose of the Valley lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the infrastructural lie. It shows that defense is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a screaming abyss for the Father. The rise of the Blue Drake is the final movement of the Border lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, security is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the conductor *** to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the Valley in this chapter is the horror of the infrastructural deterrence. We realize that sovereignty was a bloody calculation and lightning was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own insecurity. The purpose of the Workshop of the Surge was to catalog the voltage, and the fall was the beginning of the spark. As the bolt gleams on the water and the undead stands in the silent ravine, hearing the echo of the howl echoing through the empty spires. They understand that the history of the Valley is the history of the Surge, a surge that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the metabolic catastrophe that serves as the source of all mutation. This is the narrative somatic anarchy, where the physical architecture of the world, the glowing orange veins, and the subterranean magma chambers of Lost Izalith, represents the industrial heart of a failed attempt to replicate the divine. Within the roar of uncontrolled combustion and the cracking of petrified roots, the world witnessed the theological miscarriage of the flame. The lore of this era is the lore of the deformity. Its purpose was the artificial resurrection of the Age of Fire through experimental sorcery. The history of the bed is the history of the Great Blunder, where the Witch of Izalith attempted to create a second first flame, only to behold the genesis of the demons and the pollution that leaked upward to create Blighttown. This is the tragedy of the melting matriarch, proving that creation is a violence that twists the mother to satisfy the ambitious. The lore of the Bed of Chaos and the logic of the Heartless Core provides the metaphysical foundation for this chapter's ruin. As the witch wrestled with the primal soul, the flame consumed her identity, representing the total loss of order in the face of chaos. The lore suggests that the bed is the icon of the entropic motherhood. Its purpose was the standardization of the demonic spawning. By turning the woman into a root-bound insect protected by 2 glowing orbs, the chaos proved that existence is a malformed struggle, showing that divinity is a burn. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the lava. The gods needed a boundary to ensure the demon never ascended to the sun. This was the era of the molten core. This shows that the history of the bed is a history of the mutation, which turns magic into cinder. The physical environment of the dragon butts and the waste of the past provides insight into the atmospheric exhaustion of the fall. This is a space designed by accident, representing the gods' inability to govern the result of their own miracles. The lore of the bound demons explains that its purpose was the spiritual graveyard of the ancients. In the heat, the undead find that legacy is a shattered leg stuck in the ash, showing that light requires the mutilation of the pre-existing. This reveals the administrative purpose of the Izalith. The gods built a sarcophagus where the divine becomes a monster to fuel the Lord's denial. This was the era of the scorched earth. This shows that the history of the ruins is a history of the smolder. The relationship between the daughters of chaos and the fragmentation of the family represents the sociological dissolution within the narrative. From Quelaag to the Fair Lady, the sisters represented the physical shattering of the divine bloodline. The lore suggests that the sisterhood is the icon of the scattered memory. Its purpose was the maintenance of the last mercy. By escaping the bed with varying degrees of deformity, the daughters proved that order is fragile when the parent fails, showing that in Lost Izalith, love hardens into scab. This reveals the cynical purpose of the escape. The god needed the sufferer to carry the guilt. Furthermore, the lore of the Chaos Eaters and the vacuum of the deep represents the biological vacuum within the fall. These organisms developed suction cups and many eyes to absorb the chaos, representing the persistence of the swamp's ancestry in the heart of the fire. The lore suggests that the Chaos Eater is the icon of the metabolic terror. Its purpose was the maintenance of the ingestive purity. By melting the armor of the invader, the beast proved that power can be dissolved by sufficient blight, showing that in the Age of Fire, resistance becomes a liquids. This reveals the predatory purpose of the tongue. The god needed the vessel to supply the insanity of the drain. The relationship between the ceaseless discharge and the perpetual agony represents the infrastructural bleeding within the fall. The brother of the witch leaks lava from his body to soothe the sore, representing the totalitarian nature of the god's constant pain. The lore suggests that the ceaseless is the archive of the infinite weeping. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the externalized fever. By turning the sun into a volcano, the bed proved that governance kills the peace it meant to foster when the life burns too bright, showing that in Lordran, history is a lava flow. This reveals the judicial purpose of the cliff. The father built the edge to freeze the human tear. The lore of the gold-hemmed robes and the ritual of the mourning represents the ecological grief within the narrative. In the ruins, the sisters dressed in black to hide from the sun, representing the horror of the god's need for endless penance. The lore suggests that the robe is the filter of the regret. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the eternal sorrow. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a shroud to ensure that life was replaced by memory. This shows that the history of the cloth is a history of the burial. The relationship between the orange charred ring and the footstep of the fire represents the administrative oversight within the fall. An artifact grown from the limb of the centipede allows the walk on the magma, proving that the gods successfully colonized the pain. The lore suggests that the ring is the measurement of the Lord's endurance. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological anchor. By turning the injury into a tool, the bed confirmed that safety is hardness, showing that the sun required a moat of boiling rock. This reveals the defensive purpose of the lake. The god built the heat to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the flickering core, realizing that the bed of chaos was a silent factory of the misery who melted the soul to preserve the skin. The purpose of the Izalith lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the somatic lie. It shows that creation is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a churning pit for the Father. The rise of the demons is the final movement of the deformity lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, life is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the root to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the bed in this chapter is the horror of the metabolic catastrophe. We realize that innovation was a bloody calculation and lava was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own failure. The purpose of the workshop of the root was to catalog the fever, and the fall was the beginning of the chaos. As the magma gleams on the wall and the undead stands in the silent dome, hearing the echo of the crackling echoing through the empty spires. They understand that the history of the bed is the history of the root, a root that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day. The final chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Great Swamp's shadow documents the metabolic exhaustion of the ascent. This is the narrative's sovereign emergence, where the physical architecture of the world, the caking mud, and the rotted water wheel of the Blighttown exit represents the final filter between the depth and the sky. Within the rhythmic creaking of the iron elevator and the sudden piercing of the sunlight through the valley cracks, the world witnessed the theological endurance of the survivor. The lore of this era is the lore of the aftermath. Its purpose was the reintegration of the poison vessel into the divine order. The history of the return is the history of the great cleansing, where the undead bears the toxic memory of the swamp back to the altar to ensure the world remained aware of the price of the sun. This is the tragedy of the scarred witness, proving that ascension is a burden that hardens the skin to satisfy the Lord. The lore of the water wheel and the logic of the vertical retrieval provides the mechanical foundation for this chapter's climb. As the only connection between the mire and the valley, the wheel represented the physical effort required to defy the gravity of the gods. The lore suggests that the elevator is the icon of the industrial hope. Its purpose was the standardization of the forced resurrection. By lifting the flesh from the ooze through the turning of the wooden spindles, the world proved that identity is a strained resource, showing that divinity is a height. This reveals the inquisitorial purpose of the crank. The gods needed a vent to ensure the strong could return to fuel the fire. This was the era of the rising rust. This shows that the history of the wheel is a history of the torque, which turns despair into velocity. The physical environment of the narrow tunnel and the fresh air provides insight into the atmospheric shock of the fall. This is a space designed by relief, representing the gods' admission that the swamp was a finite punishment. The lore of the key to New Londo ruins explains that its purpose was the spiritual link to the drowned history. In the draft, the undead finds that freedom is a cold gate that opens onto the graveyard, showing that light requires the observation of the massacre. This reveals the administrative purpose of the passage. The gods built a sieve where the human becomes a survivor to fuel the Lord's legitimacy. This was the era of the first breath. This shows that the history of the exit is a history of the transition. The relationship between the Firelink Shrine and the restoration of the aura represents the sociological reclamation within the narrative. The undead returns to the sanctuary with the soul of the Spider Sister, representing the presence of the depths in the heart of the holy. The lore suggests that the returning pilgrim is the icon of the tainted victory. Its purpose was the maintenance of the cyclic burden. By restoring the flame with the remnant of the blight, the hero proved that order is assimilation when the shadow is absorbed, showing that in Lordran, purity hardens into hypocrisy. This reveals the cynical purpose of the homecoming. The god needed the slayer to bring the dark to the light. Furthermore, the lore of the poisoned remnant and the chronic sickness represents the biological persistence within the fall. Even on the surface, the skin retains the texture of the swamp, representing the persistence of the god's judgment in the heart of the recovery. The lore suggests that the scar is the icon of the metabolic memory. Its purpose was the maintenance of the internalized ghetto. By carrying the toxin in the blood, the man proved that safety is a permanent vulnerability, showing that in the age of fire, health becomes a postponement. This reveals the predatory purpose of the cure. The god needed the human to remember the pit to appreciate the sun. The relationship between the New Londo ruins and the ghostly echo represents the infrastructural foreboding within the fall. At the exit of the valley, the undead witnesses the water holding the spirits of the kings, representing the totalitarian nature of the gods' drowning justice. The lore suggests that the floodgate is the archive of the liquid failure. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the suppressed abyss. By walking the edge of the sunken city, the survivor proved that power kills the truth it meant to protect when the dam cracks, showing that in Lordran, history is a drowned silent. This reveals the judicial purpose of the ruin. The Father built the depths to forget the sin. The lore of the crimson robes and the sorcery of the seal represents the sacramental secrecy within the narrative. In the valley, the gear of the seal keepers rots on a corpse, representing the horror of the god's need to discard the executioner. The lore suggests that the tin banishment catalyst is the filter of the forbidden. Its purpose was the mechanical management of the mass death. This reveals the experimental purpose of the design. The gods built a weapon to ensure that life was replaced by static. This shows that the history of the robe is a history of the flood. The relationship between the sunlight and the cleansing of the filth represents the administrative oversight within the fall. Gwyn allowed the light to burn the sickness from the spirit, proving that his order relied on the cycle of pollution and purification. The lore suggests that the sun is the measurement of the Lord's sanitization. Its purpose was the creation of a psychological buffer. By bleaching the memory of the mire with the glare of the Einerlando, the gods confirmed that safety is amnesia, showing that the sun required a mote of oblivion. This reveals the defensive purpose of the light. The god built the day to avoid the dark. The act concludes with the silent observation of the open sky, realizing that Blighttown was a silent patron of the ascent, who crushed the many to elevate the one. The purpose of the Aftermath lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the vertical lie. It shows that purity is a symptom of panic. The player realizes that the Golden Age was a swaying ledge for the Father. The rise of the survivor is the final movement of the exhaustion lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, victory is not a birth. It is a cover that exhausts the winner to satisfy the crown. The legacy of the Blight in this final chapter is the horror of the metabolic exhaustion. We realize that resilience was a bloody calculation and air was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own denial. The purpose of the workshop of the Aftermath was to catalog the recovery, and the fall was the beginning of the end. As the light gleams on the sword and the undead stands in the silent shrine, hearing the echo of the wind echoing through the empty spires, they understand that the history of Blighttown is the history of the rise, a rise that gilds the fear to maintain the illusion of the day.